The blizzard came without warning. It tore across the Wyoming plains like a vengeful ghost, swallowing the horizon in white fury. The wind screamed through the pines, bending them nearly to the ground, and the snow fell so thick you couldn't see your own hand stretched out before you. The temperature plummeted to 20 below zero, and the world became a white tomb. Somewhere in that frozen hell, a man was dying. His name was Jesse Coleman, a drifter cowboy with no home and no place to die. His horse had thrown him miles back, spooked by a mountain lion's cry that echoed through the canyon like a demon's wail. Now he stumbled forward on foot, each step slower than the last, his boots crunching through ice-crusted snow that came up to his knees. His fingers had gone numb an hour ago. His face felt like stone. He couldn't feel his legs anymore, but somehow they kept moving, driven by some primal instinct to survive. But the cold didn't care about instinct. It just kept pulling him down, deeper into the white abyss. Inside a small timber cabin at the edge of the wilderness, Sarah Whitmore stood at the frost-covered window, her breath fogging the glass in small clouds. She was 32 but looked older, her dark hair streaked with premature gray, her hands rough from work that never ended. Grief had aged her. It had been 8 months since her husband Thomas died in a logging accident, crushed beneath a fallen pine that took him instantly. The county had offered sympathy, but no help. She was left alone with 2 children, a failing farm, and a winter that seemed determined to bury them all. Her son, 10-year-old Caleb, sat by the fire whittling a piece of wood with his father's knife, his face gaunt from too many meals, stretched too thin. He had his father's dark eyes and stubborn jaw, and he tried so hard to be the man of the house that it broke Sarah's heart. Her daughter, 6-year-old Emma, clutched a rag doll her mother had sewn from old flour sacks and stared into the flames as if searching for answers only fire could give. The cabin was small, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was all they had. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Outside, the wind howled like a pack of wolves. And then, through the storm, came a sound that made Sarah's heart stop. A heavy thud against the door. Then another, like something collapsing. She froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle above the mantel, the one Thomas had taught her to shoot when they first moved to this wild country. Caleb looked up from his whittling, his knife going still, his body tensing like a young animal sensing danger. Emma's eyes went wide, her small fingers gripping the doll so tight her knuckles turned white. The thud came again, weaker this time, followed by a low groan that was barely human, more like the sound of wind through a hollow tree. Sarah's mind raced. Bears sometimes came down from the mountains in desperate winter. Wolves traveled in packs. Outlaws hid in these woods, but something in that sound was different. It was the sound of surrender. She moved to the door, her pulse racing, the rifle heavy in her hands. She glanced back at her children, saw the fear in their faces, saw Caleb starting to rise to protect his mother and sister, and knew she had no choice. She lifted the wooden latch with trembling fingers and pulled the door open against the wind's resistance. Snow blasted into the cabin like a living thing, swirling and biting, and there, crumpled on the porch in a heap of frozen leather and ice, was a man. His hat was gone, lost somewhere in the storm. His coat was stiff with ice, crystallized into armor. His face was blue, his lips nearly black, his beard frosted white. He wasn't moving. A pool of snow was already forming around him, as if the storm was trying to reclaim what it had almost taken. Caleb was at her side in an instant, brave despite his fear. "Mama, is he dead?" His voice cracked on the last word. Sarah handed him the rifle and knelt down, her skirts soaking up the snow, her hands finding the man's throat beneath his frozen collar. A faint pulse. Barely there, like a bird's heartbeat, but there. "He's alive," she said. "Help me get him inside." Together, mother and son dragged the frozen cowboy across the threshold, his dead weight nearly impossible to move. Emma pushed the door closed behind them, throwing her small body against it to shut out the storm. They laid him by the fire on the bearskin rug that Thomas had tanned years ago. Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency, the way they had when she'd nursed her husband through fevers and her children through sickness. She peeled away his coat, his gloves, his vest, revealing a body that was all lean muscle and hard living. His hands were so cold they looked carved from stone, the fingers curled like claws. She wrapped him in every blanket they owned, the quilts her grandmother had made, the wool blankets from the general store, even the children's small covers. She heated broth on the fire, beef and wild onions, and held a tin cup to his cracked lips. "Come on," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Don't you die on us. Not here. Not now." She tilted his head back gently and let a few drops fall into his mouth. For a long time, nothing happened. The children watched in silence, Emma hugging her knees, Caleb standing guard by the door with the rifle. The fire popped and hissed, the wind screamed, and then, slowly, like spring breaking through winter, his chest rose with a deeper breath. His eyelids fluttered, frost melting on his lashes. And when he finally opened his eyes, they were the color of a stormy sky, gray and distant, and full of something Sarah couldn't name. Pain, maybe. Or loss. Or the kind of loneliness that comes from wandering too long with nowhere to go. Where? His voice was a rasp, like boots on gravel. "You're safe," Sarah said, her hand still on his shoulder. "You're in my home." He tried to sit up, his muscles spasming with the effort, and winced hard, falling back against the blankets. "My horse. Gone," Caleb said bluntly. The way children do when they haven't learned to soften truth with lies. The storm took it. Jesse closed his eyes, and for a moment Sarah thought he might cry. She saw his jaw clench, saw his throat work, saw him swallow down whatever grief was rising. But he didn't cry. He just nodded slowly, as if loss was something he'd learned to carry a long time ago, just another weight on shoulders already bent. The storm raged for 3 days. In that time, Jesse Coleman became part of their small world. He slept by the fire, his body slowly thawing, color returning to his face like paint bleeding back into canvas. He woke screaming once in the night, caught in some nightmare Sarah didn't ask about, and she sat with him until dawn, her hand on his arm, her presence the only medicine she could offer. When he could finally stand, wobbling like a newborn calf, he insisted on helping. Pride, she recognized, or maybe gratitude he couldn't put into words. He chopped wood with the axe that hadn't been swung properly since Thomas died, his movements efficient despite his weakened state, stacking cords against the cabin wall that would see them through another month. He fixed the door hinge that had been broken for 3 months, the one that made the door hang crooked and let in drafts. He taught Caleb how to tie a proper lasso, his rough hands guiding the boy's smaller ones, showing him the loop and the throw, the patience of it. He told Emma stories about wild horses running free across the plains, herds of 100 or more, their manes flying like flags, and the little girl laughed for the first time in months. Sarah watched him from the kitchen, her hands busy with chores that never ended, kneading bread dough, mending shirts, peeling potatoes, but her mind somewhere else entirely. There was something about this man, something quiet and steady, that made the cabin feel less empty. The silence wasn't so heavy when he was there. The work felt less impossible. The future seemed less like a wall and more like a door. One night, after the children were asleep in the loft, their soft breathing the only sound above, she sat across from him at the scarred wooden table, a cup of coffee between them, steam rising in the lamplight. "Why were you out there?" she asked. "In the storm, alone." Jesse stared into his cup for a long time, watching the coffee swirl, and she thought maybe he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice low. "Running, I guess." "From what?" He looked up, and she saw it then, the weight he carried that had nothing to do with cold or hunger. "From everything. My family's gone. Mother died of fever when I was 12. Father drank himself to death 5 years later. Lost my land in Texas to a banker who changed the terms after I'd already signed. Lost my brother in a fire I couldn't stop. Watched him burn while I stood there useless with an empty bucket. Figured the world didn't need another broken man taking up space. His hands shook slightly around the cup. So I just kept moving. No roots, no ties. Nothing to lose because I'd already lost it all. Sarah's throat tightened. She recognized that kind of pain. She'd felt it herself, staring at Thomas's grave in the frozen ground, wondering how she'd take another breath, let alone raise 2 children alone. "You're not broken," she said quietly, leaning forward. "You're here. You're breathing. You helped my son learn something his father would have taught him. You made my daughter laugh. That's not broken. That's alive." His eyes met hers across the table, and something passed between them. Something neither of them had words for, but both understood. A recognition, a connection. 2 people who'd been drowning separately, finding something to hold onto in each other. The lamplight caught the silver in his temples, the lines around his eyes, the scars on his knuckles. He wasn't a young man. Neither was she a young woman. They'd both lived enough to know that second chances were rare and precious. On the 4th morning, the storm finally broke. The sun appeared like a pale ghost behind thinning clouds, and the world outside was transformed, buried under 3 feet of pristine snow that sparkled like diamonds. The pines stood like sentinels wrapped in white, their branches bent low. The mountains beyond were sharp and clean against the blue sky. It was beautiful and terrible, this frozen world. Jesse stood on the porch, his coat buttoned, his hat one of Thomas's that Sarah had given him in his hands. His horse was gone. His old life was gone. The storm had erased his tracks. Sarah came out behind him, her shawl pulled tight against the cold that still bit despite the sunshine. Her breath came in white puffs. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd seen this before. The way men got restless, the way they looked at horizons. Jesse didn't answer right away. He looked out at the white expanse, at the mountains beyond, at the hard road that led back to whatever life he'd been running toward. Then he looked back at her, at the cabin with smoke rising from its chimney, at the 2 faces watching from the window, Caleb's serious and protective, Emma's hopeful and bright. He thought about the 3 days inside, the warmth, the laughter, the feeling of being needed instead of just endured. He thought about Sarah's hands, capable and gentle. He thought about how long it had been since he'd had a reason to stay anywhere. "A widow's kid saved a cowboy from a snowstorm," he said quietly, his voice carrying in the cold air. "And he promised to stay until the cold ends forever." Sarah's breath caught, her heart doing something strange in her chest. "Forever's a long time," she said, testing the word, tasting its weight. "Good," Jesse said, and for the first time since he'd opened his eyes in her cabin, he smiled. A real smile, not just the polite kind, but one that reached his eyes and made them less stormy. "I'm tired of running, tired of losing, tired of being alone." He turned to face her fully, his hat still in his hands, his posture open. "If you'll have me, I'll work this land. I'll fix what needs fixing. I'll protect what needs protecting. I'll stay until spring, until summer, until the snow comes again and melts again. I'll stay until we're too old to remember what cold feels like." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, the first tears she'd allowed herself in months. "Then stay," she whispered, and he did. The cold didn't end that day, or even that year. Winter in Wyoming could last until May. But inside that small cabin at the edge of the wilderness, something warmer than any fire began to grow. A family rebuilt from broken pieces, held together not by blood but by choice. A love forged in the frost, tempered by survival, proven by the simple act of staying. And a cowboy who finally found a reason to stop running, who discovered that home wasn't a place you found, but a promise you kept. Jesse Coleman never left. He married Sarah that spring when the preacher finally made it through the thawed roads. He adopted Caleb and Emma as his own. He built onto the cabin, adding rooms for the children who would come later. He worked the land until it prospered, and every winter, when the first snow fell, he'd stand on that same porch, look at his family inside, and remember the night he'd almost died. The night he'd been saved. The night his real life finally began.